Let's talk about product discovery. So I've spent over a decade in product. I have spent hundreds of hours in product discovery. And what I want to do in this video is I want to go through 4 common mistakes that no matter where you are in the world, no matter what industry you're in, I constantly see teams time and time again make these mistakes when it comes to product discovery. But more importantly, I want to actually give you some of the tools and techniques to overcome these mistakes and these challenges so you can hopefully have more effective product discovery and drive better product success. On that note, let's start with the first one, which is spending too long in product discovery. Now, you're probably thinking, hey, Ant, come on, too long in product discovery? What are you going on about? Well, the prerequisite to this video is the fact that you're doing discovery. So if you're not doing any product discovery today, some discovery is better than no discovery. So I would start there. But a very common pattern that I see with organizations that are doing discovery is that they're really treated as these big bang projects. They're not continuous discovery, you could call it, like they're not doing continuous discovery, or the continuous discovery that they're doing are like these really big, heavy, long sustained efforts. And when I say long sustained efforts, I'm really talking 3+ months. Now, there's a few causes for this and there's a few problems with this. One, it adds to a very long cycle time. If we spend 3 months in discovery before we even start building something, that is a long time to basically give value out the door to our customers. Now, there's many other causes. One of the main ones I see time and time again is just not breaking things down enough. Now, I did this video, a link will come up the top. Probably this side. I'll also throw the link down in the description as well. But I did a video about why you should break down outcomes, break down the problem space and not just solutions. So this is probably the most common mistake that I see. I'm not going to explain the whole video. You can go and watch that video. I'd encourage you to do that. But really what's happening here is we're not breaking down the problem space enough. So I'll give you the TDLR version of all of this. What I often see is we have these big goals that we want to kick off in discovery. And we want to do these big things like how might we improve the whole, onboarding process. So we think about onboarding, very long, big thing. And we're like, how might we improve that? And we're taking on this really big, chunky piece of work. Like there is a lot in that potentially, right? Like redesigning the whole thing, that can be a lot of effort. And then it's no surprise that we're doing 3, 4, 5, 6 months worth of discovery, right? So no surprise we're taking off something really big. Now, in the video, I talk about how that's a worthy goal, but we should break that goal down. Instead, we should look at the onboarding process. We should look at the metrics that we have on it. And really, we should be looking at, well, what part of the process has the largest drop-off? As an example, we can look at other metrics, right? There's plenty of other things that could drive this decision. But as an example, let's take drop-off. Now, rather than trying to improve the whole onboarding process, what we're really trying to do is, can we hone in on here and just fix that? And then if you think about discovery here, if we're doing discovery on this, the amount of discovery that we can do about how might we improve this step in the whole onboarding process is much more contained. It's much more small. And what we would do is we'll do some discovery. We'll try and fix that. We'll, again, this is why it's continuous discovery. We'll do a little bit of discovery. We'll find a solution. We'll try and solve it. We'll measure the impact. We'll do a little bit more discovery based on our findings. We'll build something else. We'll do a little bit more. And this continuous discovery cycle and delivery cycle happens. Now, a common thing that comes up that I'll just add in here, because I literally had this conversation just a couple of days ago with a senior product manager. She was saying, well, we're not a mature company. We don't have data and metrics and insights on this whole onboarding process. So what do I do there? How do I make this decision? Well, in that case, what we would do is we'll do a discovery that looks at the whole onboarding process, right? And what we'll be doing though is not trying to solve the whole thing. Again, we're breaking the problem down. What we want to look at is we want to do some discovery to understand what parts of the onboarding process need the most improvement. What parts should we focus on first? And hopefully that'll give us some data and insights into where we should focus. And then hopefully it'll come up and we'll be like, okay, let's focus there. And then we'll do another discovery effort to then try and solve that. So you can see how this is like a first pass and then a second pass. And then you can see how we could keep going in circles and over and over and over and over and over again across the whole onboarding process until we've improved onboarding to a satisfactory level. Again, this is continuous discovery and continuous delivery. So First problem is that we're just not breaking things down. We're not getting value out the door quick enough. And we really need to encourage not only breaking the outcomes down and the problem space that we're doing, we also want to encourage more continuous discovery. Now, another problem here that happens is that really, if you think about this, when it comes to discovery, what we're doing with discovery is we're trying to get information and data to make an informed decision. We're not trying to come up with the perfect thing. And discovery can't do that anyways. If it could, then people would be a lot more wealthy, especially product people and design people who are really good at discovery. They'll be much more wealthy than they are today because we'll be able to find the perfect thing through discovery. Doesn't work like that. Instead, really, we're trying to gain information and we want to make a decision. So I'm going to put effort along here. There is a point of diminishing returns. If you think about this, there is going to be a point in time where, I don't know, we'll take here, where, it's starting to taper off and plateau, right? At that point in time, you might say we have, 70 to 80% of the information. That's enough to make a decision to move forwards. And anything more, we're basically doing we could use the same amount of effort as before, and we might only go from, rather than going from 0 to 80, we might go from 80 to 90, which, you can question how much is it worth to do all of that effort just to get 10% more information to make a decision. And really, this is a longitudinal graph. It's never going to hit 100% because 100% doesn't exist, right? So there's also a point of diminishing returns here. And we also just don't want discovery to drag on too long because discovery is an investment too, right? It's an investment that should pay off, but we want to, get the best bang for buck, right? We want to get the best return on investment. So we kind of want to hit that point of diminishing returns and we want to stop discovery. We want to make a decision and we want to move on. So a tool to give you something to help solve this, besides the whole breaking outcomes down thing, encourage you to watch that video. A tool to help you do this is to time box discovery. So time boxing, it would be really nice if we could nail that time box and the time box, makes us hit that point of diminishing returns. But that's a very subjective thing. It's got to do with your risk appetite. It's got to do with how much information you have, how much are you willing, how much information do you feel like you need, how much confidence do you have. There's a lot of how much risk. There's a lot of dimensions there. It's very subjective. But what a time box does is it can help us to not go too far beyond that point of diminishing returns. Let's say, theoretically, we set a 3-week time box, right? And let's say 3 weeks actually got us to here. And the point of diminishing returns was the 2-week mark. Well, the beautiful thing about the 3-week time box is unless we picked it up earlier, that we've already passed that point, we've only traveled 1 more week over, right? As opposed to not having the time box, and then we can easily be gone for 3 months. And then suddenly somebody asks questions, stakeholders start asking questions. They're like, what is happening? Why is it taking so long? And then at that point, we kind of, pull the brakes and then stop. So a time box is going to help us do that. Equally, a time box might make us stop here, and then we can reflect and we can set another time box, and we might set the time box shorter this time. So if this was 3 weeks, we might set another 2 weeks or another 1 week. And this is, again, a way that we can start to bracket our way towards that point of diminishing returns without, basically dragging over. So a time box is a good stake in the ground to help you basically not go over that point of diminishing returns. The other thing a time box does is it helps with this whole continuous discovery thing. For example, if that first, if you needed to do discovery across the whole onboarding process, if we set that to be 2 weeks, let's just spend 2 weeks to get enough information to make a decision on where we're going to focus inside that onboarding process. That is great. Then we might say, well, let's actually spend 4 weeks here looking at that piece of the puzzle. Now, all up, all we've spent is 6 weeks doing discovery, and we haven't tried to do the whole thing, and we haven't let this overcook either. We haven't spent a long time there as well. So time boxing is a great tool. Now, some of you are going to be asking, how do I set a time box? What's an appropriate time box? I got this great tool from Jeff Patton. So highly encourage taking his Passionate Product Leadership course. No affiliation there. I just think Jeff is a really good person. It's a great course. He's got some great stuff in there. And one of the models that he has in this book that he's adapted, and I've also adapted to my own use, is this model that looks like this. So essentially what we have is we have how much evidence or confidence we have, or the bet that you're willing to make, and then how much investment you're going to put into discovery. And essentially what he's trying to detail here is that there's a safe zone, which is based on how much existing evidence we have, how much risk there is, how much confidence we have in the thing that we need to do discovery on. There is a relationship between that and how much time we should invest into discovery. So he calls the stupid zone, where you don't invest enough into discovery. And then there's also a zone where you can overbake it, right? Where you spend too long in discovery when you didn't need to. Now, again, this is all subjective. And I've got a way that I've adapted this, and I talk about how I use this in order to set a time box and facilitate a conversation about it. I talk about that in my product discovery kickoff workshop. There is a video walkthrough, put it up in the banner up here. I'll also throw a link in the description, so you can go watch that. You can see how I use that, and I explain how I use it to set an initial time box inside product discovery. But the principle here, or the solution here, or the thing that's going to help you make sure that we're not spending too long on discovery, is to time box discovery. Okay, a lot in that first one, but that's why I wanted to start there. The second thing that I see teams make, or the second mistake that I see all the time, is not testing your assumptions. So I talk to teams all the time, they're doing product discovery, and I'm like, what are you doing discovery on? And they would tell me, like, we're looking into this problem space. I'm like, cool. How did you come up? They might have something like a survey or like an interview guide. And I'll ask them, how did you come up with those questions? How did you determine those questions were the things to ask? And they won't really have a strong answer for me. Besides, well, we thought that would be good questions to ask. Now, the truth of the matter when it comes to discovery is an investment, and we don't want to spend longer in discovery than we need to. So one of the things that we can do in order to ensure that is to test our assumptions. So discovery is all about gaining confidence in a space to, again, make a decision, right? It's a de-risking tool. We use research techniques to gain information, to then gain confidence in an idea, to then make a decision to proceed with a solution. We could also get information that tells us that we should bin the idea, and that's perfectly fine. That is one of the goals of discovery, is to bin the bad ideas and only proceed with the good ones. Now, a way to structure all of that and to think about, well, what do I need to learn? What do I need to gain confidence with in discovery, is to think about your assumptions. Now, one of my favorite tools to do this is a tool known as Assumptions Mapping by David J. Bland. It comes out of the book called Testing Business Ideas. And it's basically a 2x2 matrix where on the y-axis we have importance, so high importance to low importance. And then on the x-axis we have evidence. Basically, you have no evidence and then you have some evidence, right? Now, assumptions mapping is a fantastic tool because what assumptions mapping does is it helps us prioritize our assumptions. So there's a real structured way you can do assumptions mapping. I would encourage you to Google it, read up about it. David Bland also runs a assumptions mappings course as well, so you can take that. Essentially, what ends up happening inside the assumptions map, and what assumptions mapping is so great for, is the things in the top right-hand quadrant, the things that are high importance and no evidence, are going to be your riskiest assumptions. They are going to be the things that you really want to invest into and to be focused on in discovery. Because if you're wrong about these things, they are your riskiest assumptions. They could destroy the whole idea. We could, this thing won't be viable or it won't be desirable or won't be feasible or whatever, right? These are your riskiest assumptions. So you want to focus your discovery efforts there. One of the ways to make sure that we are being intentional in discovery and we are focusing on the right things and we are getting that, per unit of time spent in discovery, the maximum outcome, is to do things like assumptions mapping, to map out your assumptions, and then to make sure that you're doing discovery in an intentional way. So the next steps after you do your assumptions mapping is to turn those assumptions into tests. So what I would often do, and what I like to do, is I take these assumptions and then I turn them or frame them into hypotheses. The whole idea of a hypothesis statement is basically, how are we going to test this? We'll test this by, and we'll know this is true when we see X, is basically a very simple assumption statement. In the book Testing Business Ideas, he has experiment cards and there's a whole bunch of other techniques here. But the principle that you need to take away here is we need to take an assumption and then we need to turn that assumption into a test, and then we need to go and test that assumption. Now, a test could be to interview customers. It could be to build a prototype and to do some user testing. It could even be to do a survey or something like that. And this is where discovery gets a little bit tricky because it's not as easy as saying you need to do this, like interview people, then do this and then do that. It's because it really depends on the assumptions that you're trying to test. Depending on the assumption would depend on the test. One thing I like to do is just track all these, track the experiments that we're doing, track the things that we're testing as part of discovery. And this is a great way to make sure that discovery is intentional. We are making sure we're testing assumptions and we're not just walking in discovery and just making it up as we go, right? So that's common mistake number 2, is not testing your assumptions. Mistake number 3 that I see all the time is only interviewing existing users. So I got a story I got to tell you about this one, right? Recently, I've been coaching a head of product at a startup here in Australia, and he was basically started the job. So he only recently just started, and he was looking at a bunch of research that the team had pulled together. Basically, they're looking at building out a new product offering that's going to go out into market, that's going to focus or at least target a market segment that's not their existing customers. So it's a completely new product, completely new market segment that they don't touch today. And the team had done some great research into this space for the product. The only problem that they had was they only interviewed existing customers. Going back to what this new offering and the target market segment for this new offering was that no existing customers are within the target market segment for this new offering. So whilst the team had done all this great research and there was all this great data and insights, it's very hard to understand whether those insights are actually valid or not. Because it could be true for these customers and this market segment, but this market segment is not the ideal market segment for this new product offering. And I see this all the time. And I get it, because finding and recruiting customers to interview and users to interview is hard. Being able to draw upon your pool of existing users is easy, is much easier. Not easy, I shouldn't say it's easy. It's not easy, but it's easier, right? It's easier to pull upon that pool of your current users, as opposed to going out and trying to find people who aren't your users and trying to work out whether they're in your market segment and whether they potentially use some of your competitors or something like that. That is much harder to do. Now, there's some recruitment agencies out there that can help you do that. There's other ways that you can do that, but we need to be mindful that we don't just take the easy path. We're actually doing what is right and what is the right thing to do for the things that we're going to test. So this comes back to my previous point about testing assumptions. If we're really clear on the assumptions that we're going to test, and we really sit down and think about how we're going to test that, we should also be very clear about who we need to do it with. Now, in this case, the who was not existing customers. They had to go out and find somebody else. And like I said, I get it, that is hard, but we should put that effort in, because now we've basically spent weeks and weeks on discovery that kind of has questionable results, or at least our trust and confidence in the data is quite low. Now, I see this play out in other ways, right? So that's perhaps an extreme example, but here's another example, right? Imagine going back to that onboarding process example. Imagine if I only interviewed customers who had successfully onboarded, right? So if I only interviewed users that made it all the way through the user onboarding process. One of the dangers with that is if I'm trying to fix a part of the funnel, I'm not talking to those people who dropped off. And this is often known as selection bias or survivorship bias, right? So what is happening is I'm only talking to those who actually survive and successfully make it through the onboarding process, which there's value in their feedback. But you could argue that the people who are more valuable to speak to are the people who didn't make it through, who got frustrated and dropped off. They're the people that we should be talking to. Now, again, getting those people is hard. But one of the dangers with selection bias is we've basically got a biased set of data and insights, and we're basically making product decisions that is biased. And we might be missing out something that's really critical. And all these people who dropped off for the same reason. And if we just never talk to them, and we only talk to those who made it through, that selection bias, i.e., that segment of users, they made it through because they don't have that thing, whereas everybody else did have that thing. So I see this play out in many different ways, but that is another great example of it. So solutions to this, how do we solve this? Well, one of them is to go back to being intentional about discovery and starting with your assumptions. Again, what are you trying to solve? What assumptions do we have? How are we going to test it? And then think about who we are going to test it with. So I have an interview guide I'll throw the link to a template for it. And this is the typical user guide that I'll basically write up when I'm going to do some user interviews. This is basically a bit of a research plan if you think about it that way. I'll throw a link in the description below, but you'll see in the interview guide that I have a section for target users. So if we think about what we're looking at, who is the ideal target that we should be talking to for this problem space, right? So the first thing is to spend time identifying that and actually defining who your target user is. You'll also find in the template that I have this table down the bottom, which is all about people to interview. This is something else I do, which is basically I build a big table of what is the types of attributes, and again, I'm segmenting, right? Like what are the attributes that I'm looking for when it comes to people I want to interview? And what I'm trying to do here is, again, not fall victim to selection bias. One of the things that becomes immediately obvious in the table is whether I have selection bias or not. If I notice that I have all these people with the same attributes, I can start asking myself the question of whether I am having selection bias here, right? And then the opposite is true. If I've got this nice little cross section of different attributes and stuff, I can see that, okay, good. I'm talking to both users and non-users and, different attributes in different segments, right? Okay, last one, number 4. The last common trap that I see product teams and product managers make all the time with product discovery is not gathering multiple inputs. Now, this is quite similar to the one that we just talked about with selection bias and, only interviewing existing customers. But one of the dangers with discovery, again, is that we can almost always find information that supports our thing, right? We see it all the time with people who go and do Google searching. They look for stuff and they're like, hey, this person agrees with me. And we find things to confirm our existing beliefs. There's this really great mantra. I don't remember where I heard it, but it was basically come up with ideas like you're right, but test them like you're wrong. This is a very good first principle for discovery. The goal of discovery is not to walk in there and to confirm your existing beliefs. It's to challenge them. You want to find data that, is challenging your existing ideas, because again, it's easy to manipulate data, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that is going to basically reinforce what you already think and what you already believe. So one of the ways that we combat this is by making sure we're gathering multiple data inputs and we're not making decisions on a single data input. So going back to the selection bias thing would be, I'm going to try and avoid making a decision by only interviewing existing customers. Depending on what we're trying to learn, for example, onboarding is a good one. I want to look at people who didn't make it through the process as well as people who did make it through the process. Again, multiple data inputs, not just one. So to give you another story around this, just to make this really real, I was doing some discovery. I was working with a team. We're doing some discovery in a space that was basically looking at fuel stations and the problem space that, really large semi-trailer trucks don't fit in every single fuel station. So some fuel stations are the roof's too low. They're going to, take the roof off. Some fuel stations are too tight. You just can't physically drive a truck in and drive it out. Others are missing, important amenities like things like high flow diesel. So it takes you forever to fill up the truck, or it's missing, other things, right? Anyways, the first thing we did when we got into discovery, we did everything we talked about, assumptions mapping, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the easiest things that we could do to get some data points on this was just to look at the existing data that they had on the fuel stations. So they had data on whether the fuel station had, high flow diesel. It had things like whether, how high the roof was in the fuel station. So there's a bunch of data points that we can immediately look at and basically look at and say X percentage of service stations a semi-trailer could not fit into. And unsurprisingly, because we were looking at this problem space, it came back that was true. That, a large portion of service stations, semi-trailer trucks can't fit into. Now, we could have easily just drew the line there and been like, great, supports our hypothesis. Let's go ahead and start to build out a solution and look at solutions for this problem space. But we didn't do that. We did what I'm talking about here, which is to gather multiple data points. So we challenged ourselves. We're like, well, what else do we need to know? What other assumptions are we making around here? And some of the assumptions that we had was like, where are these service stations located, right? So we know that, more than a large percentage of them don't support trucks, but are they even on major truck routes? Because if they're not, then is it really a problem that they can't fit a truck? Other ones we had was that this is a problem. In fact, that, the truck drivers actually struggle with this, that they can't find a fuel station that they can fit in, among a whole bunch of other assumptions that we had. And what we did was we didn't just base it on the quantitative data that we had. We went and got some qualitative data. We actually went out and interviewed a bunch of truck drivers, and we did a few other things as well. But some of the things, I won't bore you with the whole detail, but some of the things that came back from that discovery with the truck drivers were that they drive those routes all the time, literally multiple times a day. So most truck drivers know which fuel stations they can fit into and which fuel stations they can't. And it's pretty rare that they're not on a route that they normally drive. And if they were to pick up a new route, they would actually have a handover period where they would ride in the truck and drive with the previous person who used to drive that route. So all in all, it was actually very rare, it was by exception, that semi-trailer truck drivers would find themselves in a position where they couldn't find a service station that, their truck would fit in. But things do happen, right? Like roadworks, etc., etc. Another piece of very interesting data that we got out of it, because we were looking at potentially a mobile solution around this, not getting ahead of ourselves, but that's pretty much the space that we're kind of looking at. One of the things that we also realized, well, what happens when you run into this situation? And what they did was they basically invited us into the truck and they pointed to the old CB radio. So they've got these radios that you can basically talk to truck drivers. And at least here in Australia, mobile phone laws are really strict. So they can use the CB radio, that is completely legal. But using a mobile phone, there's a lot of strict laws, it needs to be hands-free, all that type of stuff. And essentially, they would be far more likely to jump on the CB radio and ask the trucker network, to help them out and to find a service station that's near them that they will fit into. And essentially, because truck drivers drive the same routes over and over again, there would be someone within that radius that would be able to guide them and help them. And ultimately, through a whole bunch of other data points, we found that wasn't a viable product to basically go down and to look into. That wasn't really a problem that was worth solving. But you can see how we could have easily made the decision based on the quantitative data that we gathered right at the beginning to say, yes, we should proceed this. But instead, what we did was we gathered multiple data points to make an informed decision. So to wrap this one up, a way to make sure that you're doing product discovery effectively and you're avoiding falling into this trap is to just never make a decision on a single data point. I pretty much always force myself to have at least 2 to 3 data points or more to then make a decision off. And I want them to be different data points, right? So this is a good example of why we want to mix quantitative data with qualitative data. Does the qualitative data support the quantitative data? Vice versa. If not, if there's a delta between that, then we should investigate why and we should hold out on making a decision because something is wrong here, right? Another thing that I do, going back to the assumptions and turning assumptions into tests, is that I will often turn an assumption into 2 or more tests. So pretty rarely test an assumption in isolation, like a single test for that assumption. I want to find multiple ways that I can test that assumption, and I want to run multiple concurrent tests. So an example of that might be, just to give a very simple example, might be that I turn the assumption into 2 or 3 questions to ask in an interview. So I'm not trying to ask a single question. There's many reasons for that. I actually did a webinar on user interviewing and coming up with user interviewing guides. So I'll throw that one up there as well and a link in the description. So if you want to learn more about user interviewing and how to do that well, whole webinar on that one. But what I'll do is I'll turn that into a few questions. So I'm not asking it directly and I'm making sure that I'm asking it from multiple angles and I'm using those multiple data points to basically triangulate and to make a decision. Again, avoid things like yes or no type questions. There's a whole bunch of stuff around user interviewing. But essentially, in a nutshell, I want to avoid making a decision on a single data point alone. And one of the things that I would be looking at when I'm trying to build my research plan, I'm looking at discovery and running discovery, is to just make sure that I am gathering multiple data inputs and that I'm not basing decisions on any one data alone. So that's it. That is 4 common product discovery mistakes that I see product teams and product managers make. Hopefully this video has given you a whole bunch of new tools and techniques to help you do product discovery better, make it just that little bit more effective, that little bit more intentional. If you want to learn more about product discovery or other product management topics and techniques about how to just build better products, check out productpathways.com. I'm building out a whole bunch of resources as well as a community over there that is designed to help you do product better. Let me know if there's something that I missed. If you think of some other common discovery mistake that you see all the time, throw it in the comment below. If you have a question or a follow-up about any of the techniques that we went through, let me know as well. And I would encourage you to go check out my product discovery kickoff workshop, as well as that user interview webinar that I talked about how to go about building and crafting those user interviews. I'll throw that here as well. So check them out. Go ahead, do it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next one.